You spend enough time on the road, you learn to trust two things: your rig and your gut. My rig is a Peterbilt 389, 14 years old, but runs sweeter than the day she rolled off the line. My gut, well, my gut's a little older, and it's kept me out of trouble more times than I can count. It's the thing that tells you to check your tires one more time before a mountain pass, or to skip that greasy spoon diner that just looks off. And on a long, dark stretch of I-80, somewhere deep in the Wyoming void, my gut was screaming at me. It was about 2 in the morning. I was hauling a reefer full of California produce to Chicago, a run I'd done 1,000 times. There's a section of I-80 out there that's not just empty. It feels like you're driven off the edge of the world. No lights, no towns, just the endless ribbon of asphalt under your high beams and the drone of the Cummins engine. It's a hypnotic, lonely place. That's when I saw him. He was just standing there, on the shoulder. A tall, thin silhouette against the darkness. Not sticking his thumb out, not waving, just standing perfectly still, like a statue someone had left by the side of the road. Every rule in the trucker's handbook says you don't stop. You never stop. You don't know who's out here in the middle of the night. My gut was a clanging fire bell in my chest. Drive on, old man. Drive on. But there was something else, too. A pull. Maybe it was the loneliness of the cab. Maybe it was the way he stood. Not threatening, just lost. I slowed the rig down, the air brakes hissing in the dead quiet of the night. I figured I'd at least see if he was in trouble. I pulled the Pete over onto the shoulder about 50 yards past him. I watched him in my side mirror. He didn't run towards the truck. He just walked, a slow, steady, unhurried pace. He came up to the passenger door and waited. I rolled down the window. "Need a hand?" I asked. He looked up. He was older than I thought, maybe in his 60s. He wore an old tweed jacket, the kind a college professor would wear. His face was pale and long, and his eyes seemed to hold a deep, settled sadness. He smelled faintly of dust and old paper. "I would be very grateful for a ride," he said. His voice was quiet, dry like the rustle of turning pages. "Just a little ways up the road." My gut was still twisting, but my mouth said, "Hop in." He opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat, moving with a stiff sort of grace. He didn't have a bag, nothing. He buckled his seatbelt, placed his hands neatly in his lap, and stared forward into the darkness as I emerged the big rig back onto the empty interstate. The silence in the cab was suddenly heavier than it had been when I was alone. We drove for maybe 10, 15 miles without a word. I tried to break it. "Headed far?" I asked. He turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were unnervingly focused. "Not so far," he replied. "I'm just trying to get back to my route." "What route is that?" "The one I was on before," he said, and then fell silent again. The guy gave off a strange vibe, and I figured the less I knew, the better. I just wanted to get him to the next truck stop and be on my way. Then he started talking, unprompted. "There was a man," he began, looking straight ahead. "A salesman. He drove this same stretch of highway week after week. He sold industrial solvents. A lonely job. He spent more time with the voices on the radio than he did with his own family." I gripped the wheel a little tighter. It felt a bit too close to home. "One night," the man continued, "he was driving, just like this. The road was empty, but in his rearview mirror, he saw a single pair of headlights. He didn't think anything of it. He drove for an hour, and the headlights were still there, keeping the same distance. He sped up a little. The headlights sped up. He slowed down. They slowed down. He paused, and I found myself holding my breath. The salesman started to get nervous. He told himself it was just a coincidence. He took the next exit, a little two-pump gas station. He pulled in, pretending to check his tires, and watched as the other car drove past. It was an old, dark sedan. He felt a wave of relief, but when he got back on the interstate, 10 minutes later, there it was again, the same headlights, a mile or so behind him. I glanced in my own mirror, nothing but blackness. This went on for hours, the passenger said. The salesman's mind began to play tricks on him. He started to think he could see his shape in the driver's seat, a pale face. The paranoia was like a fever. He was convinced the car wasn't just following him, it was hunting him. He gripped his steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the terrifying, relentless lights behind. He stopped talking. The story just hung there in the air between us, thick and heavy. "So what happened to him?" I finally asked, my throat dry. The man turned to me, a faint, sad smile on his lips. He just kept driving. The man's story stuck to me like road grind. I couldn't shake it. Every few minutes, my eyes would flick to my mirrors, half expecting to see a pair of phantom headlights. The road was still empty, but it didn't feel that way anymore. It felt watched. We drove on in that heavy silence for what must have been another hour. I was starting to get near Cheyenne, thinking I could drop him at the Little America truck stop. "Here," the man said, suddenly. I looked around. There was nothing. We were in the absolute middle of nowhere. No exit, no crossroads, no lights. "Here?" I asked. "There's nothing here." "This is my stop," he said, his tone final. I didn't argue. I slowed the rig and pulled over to the shoulder. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Thank you for the ride," he said. I didn't wait to watch him. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, putting the hammer down. I drove for 5 miles, then 10, before I finally risked a look in my mirror. There was no one on the shoulder. He was just gone. I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. It was just a weirdo, I told myself. A drifter with a knack for spooky tales. It wasn't until I pulled into the truck stop in Cheyenne for fuel that I saw it. Sitting perfectly centered on the passenger seat where the man had been was a book. It was old, bound in dark, cracked leather with no title on the cover. I hadn't seen him carrying it. I know I would have noticed. It couldn't have been there before. My heart started pounding. He had left it behind. I picked it up. The leather was cool and smooth under my fingers. It felt ancient. My first instinct was to throw it in the trash, but another part of me was curious. I put it on the dashboard and went to fuel up, but I just knew I was gonna open it. I sat in the diner at Little America for an hour, trying to work up the nerve. The book was sitting there on the dash, a dark little rectangle. It felt less like an object and more like a challenge. Finally, I paid my bill and walked back to my truck. "All right, let's see what you're all about," I muttered. I picked it up. The pages were yellowed and brittle. I opened it to the first page. There was a title, written in elegant old-fashioned script. It said, "The Headlights in the Mirror." A chill went straight down my spine. I started to read. It was him. It was the salesman. It was the exact same story the man had told me, word for word. The lonely stretch of I-80, the single pair of headlights, the growing paranoia. I read on, my hands trembling. The story detailed the salesman's descent into madness. He started seeing a pale, thin face in his own reflection. He started hearing whispers on his radio. The story ended with the salesman pulling his car over to the side of the road, unable to take it anymore, getting out of his vehicle and simply waiting. The final sentence was, he stood on the shoulder,
waiting for the next ride, so the story could be told again. I slammed the book shut. My heart was a drum against my ribs. This wasn't a story. It was a warning, or a curse. I threw the book onto the passenger side floor and started the engine. I had to get back on the road. I pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto I-80 heading east. I just had to make it to sunrise. I drove for an hour, my eyes glued to my mirrors. The road was busy now, with a few other trucks for company. I felt safer. And then, most of the trucks turned off at the I-25 junction. The road ahead grew quiet again. And in my mirror, about a mile back, a single pair of headlights appeared. I told myself it was nothing. They stayed there. When I sped up to 75, they sped up. When I dropped down to 60, they dropped down. I knew what was happening. My radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. It wasn't music or chatter. It was static. But underneath the static, I could almost hear it. A low, dry whisper. I was living the story. The book wasn't just a book. It was a script. And I was the new main character.
Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It cuts through exhaustion. It cuts through logic. All I could think about were the words in that book, the pale face in the reflection, the whispers on the radio, the relentless hunting headlights that were still pinned in my rearview mirror. My eyes kept darting from the road to the mirror to the radio, then back to the mirror. The static from the CV radio was getting louder. Now, I swear I could hear a voice in it now. A dry, papery voice, telling a story about a truck driver on a lonely stretch of I-80. My story. I couldn't take it. I couldn't be that salesman. I wasn't gonna let the story finish. With a yell that was half fear and half rage, I reached down and snatched the book off the floor. It felt cold in my hand. I didn't slow down. I held the wheel with my left hand, rolled down the passenger window with my right, and without a second thought, I hurled the book out into the screaming wind and darkness. I watched in the side mirror as it tumbled through the air behind me, an insignificant dark speck swallowed by the night. The second it was gone, the static from the CB radio cut out. Silence. I held my breath and looked in my rear view mirror. The road was empty. The headlights were gone. I drove for another 10 miles before my shaking hands forced me to pull over at a rest stop. I sat there in the cab, watching the first gray hint of dawn appear on the horizon. Was it real? Or was I just a tired man who'd let a spooky story get into his head? I don't have an answer. I never will. I finished that run to Chicago, and I've driven that stretch of I-80 in Wyoming a dozen times since. I drive it faster now. I don't stop, not for anything. I keep the radio loud, and I drink enough coffee to keep my eyes wide open. But I'm telling you this for a reason. They call them road legends, ghost stories, little tales to pass the time at truck stops. But some stories feel more real than others. So if you're ever out there, on that long, dark piece of road between Laramie and Rawlins, and you see a thin, solitary figure standing on the shoulder in your headlights, my advice, just keep driving. Don't you dare stop. Some books aren't meant to be opened. And some stories are looking for a new ending. You don't want it to be yours.